Thank you very much, and I want to welcome everybody here from NIH in general. NIH is the nation's leading biomedical research institution. It funds research across the country in pretty much all different types of health disorders, and our goal is to try and understand the fundamental knowledge about the body and to use that knowledge to develop treatments for people with disorders and reduce the burden of disease. And so, as people in this room may know, NIH made a strong commitment, led by Dr. Collins, who will talk to you tomorrow, to basically throw all the weight that NIH has scientifically at this very vexing problem of trying to understand how ME/CFS occurs and how we can best treat it. And so we're really excited to have people here today to talk about the work that they're doing. The people here at NIH are listening closely to try to use that information to help us plan for a brighter future. And I'd also say it's my pleasure to work for Vicky and Joe, who really are the leaders in this area for NIH, and we've been really blessed with really good support staff to go out to the community and get this research going. So just to say a couple of things about our institute. As you can see here, as I mentioned, the NIH mission, our mission is parallel to that, but it focuses on the brain, the peripheral nervous system, muscle, and we're trying to understand fundamental knowledge about how these things work and then use that knowledge to develop better treatments. And what we find, we've had some successes for sure in terms of treating neurological diseases, but we've also had lots of failures, and the failures are usually due to the fact that we made assumptions going into the clinical trials that we just didn't really have the fundamental knowledge, and there were these gaps, and we jumped across an assumption that turned out to be a fatal flaw. And so trying to understand the basics of what is going on in a disease is absolutely critical. Until you really understand it totally, anytime you go into a clinical trial, you're running into a risk of a failed clinical trial. So we have to always try and take advantage of what we know and see if it can move into a clinical trial to help, but at the same time try and build this fundamental knowledge so that the success rate of the clinical trial goes up and up and up over time. We also are very cognizant of the fact that science occurs in a stepwise fashion, and that the work that's being done now oftentimes we'll see tremendous fruition 10, maybe 20 years from now. And what that means is that critical to the general effort is to train the workforce that's going to work in this incremental fashion on ME/CFS, hopefully with more promising treatment options as time goes on. But without that workforce, things will stall. And so we're really excited yesterday to have a tremendous group of early stage and mid stage investigators in ME/CFS, and we're working hard across the NIH to kind of help them flourish, but also we need to bring many more people into this field. We don't have the workforce that we need to take on such a major health problem at this point in time, but we're hopeful that we can move into that space with an expanding, really dedicated, talented workforce. So in our institute and in many institutes across NIH, we fund research that goes from basic discovery all the way to clinical trials. In general, we don't do clinical trials on brand new medicines that are developed by the pharmaceutical companies, but we do a lot of research that de-risks that process and makes it more attractive for the pharmaceutical industries to test therapies, because we provide the science that gives them a sense of what their chances of, their probability is that those clinical trials will be successful. And we actually also in our institute will run first-in-human trials of drugs that are owned by pharmaceutical companies because they're not going to be able to get the resources without a package that shows that it's hitting its target in humans. So we go at least as far as that, as well as we have grant mechanisms where we can bring molecules or small molecules biologics or devices to the point where they can be ready to go to the FDA to get clearance to go into clinical trials. So we try and fund across this whole spectrum of research, and toward the end we have a lot of interactions with the industry partners who are the ones who are going to bring therapies to patients. Now, so I'm a neurologist. I'm from NINDS. I have a very brain-centric view of things. I think the brain is really, really important. I think the immune system is good because it helps take care of the brain, but the heart is good because the brain can suck blood out of the heart. So just a caveat there, a very brain-centric person. But clearly we know from ME/CFS, talking to patients, that there are a lot of neurological complaints, deficits, so cognitive difficulties, called brain fog, fatigue. Fatigue is a mental state, and so it has a brain circuit that underlies that state. Many people talk about hypersensitivity to sound or touch, and that is a brain circuit that starts in the periphery where you have sensory receptors, goes into dorsal root ganglion cells, into the spinal cord, up to the brain, and at all those sites you can mediate, you can turn the gain up and down on the sensation, and then how it's perceived in the brain is sometimes very difficult to get at, but we clearly know that there's a detector system and then there's a perception system, and they are connected, but they are also working separately. So how you react and the emotional component that goes with a sensation, these are all things that we're studying very intensely, not just at NINDS, but in many of the neuroscience institutes. And when you think about fatigue or exertional intolerance, from a neurologist's point of view, we would say that the brain is doing a calculation all the time. Every time you act, there's a calculation that goes on in the brain about what's the effort that's required to do and what's the reward for doing it. That's a very simplistic view of how the brain works, but it holds true in many different instances. And so, and we know from just our own experiences that that set point about when the brain makes those decisions goes up and down. When you are really refreshed and energetic, then there's a particular gain that you are working at, and you can take on things that when you're been up for 14 hours, you're not going to be able to do anymore. When you exercise, you are running at top speed when you get off and going. But after a couple of miles, the idea of sprinting is like, no, that's not going to happen. And that's a calculation that's going on in the brain based on the sensations that are coming into your brain. And so trying to understand even the basic knowledge of how the brain makes those decisions could be very important to us. So what NIH has been doing over the last couple of years is really trying to galvanize across the institutes to bring in the best science and attack ME/CFS. And this is done with what we call the Trans-NIH ME/CFS Working Group. And this group meets regularly. It has representatives from all the institutes and centers at NIH. And together, the group decided that the best thing we could do to get things, trying to get, kind of launch a much more significant effort in ME/CFS was to actually develop a collaborative research center and data management coordinating center group. And the idea here is that this is not the everything about where ME/CFS research is done. This is just kind of establishing a beachhead where we can get a coordinated effort going, and the hope is that this will branch out and research will start to come from many, many different areas. But in looking at what happened in the past, we think that trying to coordinate the research and the data findings is incredibly important. If we're left with multiple different reports from multiple different groups that are doing things differently, the progress is going to be really slow. So we really need to always go from that next step, which we call discovery, to the point of validation. And to validate things, you really need a group to do it together. And that's what we think this group has the opportunity to do for the first time. So we're really looking forward to what it does. But we're hoping also it'll put a much brighter light on ME/CFS research, and it will develop research at many, many more institutions across the country. So the centers, which you'll be hearing about from today, are 3 currently, and they are coordinated by a Data Management Coordinating Center at RTI. The principal investigator there is Linda Brown, who came from the National Cancer Institute, so she knows a great deal about how NIH works. And so there's the Cornell Research Center, which is up at Ithaca in New York City, and also collaborating with Mark Van Ness at the University of Pacific, Stockton, California, for its clinical pieces. Ian Lipkin's group is at Columbia, and they've been working with the clinical groups and the samples that were developed by Sue Levine in New York City, Dan Peterson in Nevada, and Jose Montoya at Stanford. And then Daria Unitmatz at Jackson Lab in Connecticut, working with Cindy Bateman at the Bateman Horn in Salt Lake City. So we have, these are really serious ME/CSF investigators, and they have their hooks into different clinical sites for samples and patients, and so we really have really high hopes that this group can do really quality work at their institutions, but more so to actually come together and do things together. So in this program, we reserve funds for a joint project that they have to agree upon and do jointly. And that, I think, was our, kind of heavy-handed approach to say no more, little experiments here and there, but really try to go to that next step and we're happy to fund that next step to a validation of the initial findings. For folks who are interested how this is going, RTI has a website that will continue to be updated and let the community know about how the work is going. I would also say, importantly, that NIH developed what's called a council working group for ME/CFS research, and so there's a group that's formed and has been doing really a lot of soul searching, a lot of heavy investigator work to come up with recommendations on how best we move forward to the next step in ME/CSF research at NIH. This is currently attached to the NINDS Council, but that's just a formality. Their reports will be circulated to all the trans-NIH working groups and all the councils that take part in ME/CFS research. And so the extension for information on, we have a request out publicly soliciting input on how best to advance ME/CFS research. As you can see, the website here, the deadline to get this in so they can get into the report for the working group is May 1st, 2019. So please, if you have thoughts, particularly after this meeting, on what we should be doing, please put your ideas into this request for information on the web. And with that, I'd just like to say we're incredibly anxious and looking forward to the discussions that are going on over the next couple of days, and hoping that we can, see through the fog and see some real opportunities that we can finally get to solutions for patients. So on behalf of the other NINDS directors, I want to thank everybody for coming, and for the people who are doing the work and the patients who are participating. It's really a tremendous effort, and we really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Koroshetz. It's my pleasure to introduce the next speaker, who also provides some introductory comments. So this is a trans-NIH effort, is reflected by Dr. Koroshetz and NINDS and myself and others at NIAID, in Allergy Infectious Diseases. And in that spirit, I'd like to introduce Dr. Hugh Auchincloss, who's the Principal Deputy Director of NIAID.
Good morning. My name is Hugh Auchincloss. I'm the Principal Deputy Director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, and I'm here to welcome you and to thank you for coming to this important meeting. When I walked down the hall to come into the auditorium, I saw signs to the NIAID conference on ME/CFS. That's a technicality that the signs were printed that way. This was a totally trans-NIH, indeed trans-community effort to put together this important meeting. There have been input from all the institutes at NIH and from the scientific community at large and from the patient community. So this is not strictly an NIAID undertaking. I also want to echo Walter's comments about the event yesterday, which I think is almost as important as this event, which was the workshop for young investigators who want to enter the field of ME/CFS because they are the future, and that's the young talent that we need to proceed ahead. Now, the mission of the NIAID is to perform basic and applied research in the areas of immunology and infectious diseases. It's very hard for me to imagine that as we learn more about ME/CFS, that we're not going to find that one or both of these fields is intimately involved. Therefore, our institute was enthusiastic when Dr. Collins committed the NIH to a renewed effort on this syndrome, and we immediately became active in participation in the trans-NIH ME/CFS working group that Walter has told you about. We've supported some of the applications that have come in from investigators, and we're co-funding the CRCs, the collaborative research centers that he just told you about. And we have our own intramural investigators who are participating in NDS-led ME/CFS clinical research. In addition to our efforts as part of the trans-NIH group, NIAID is committed itself to further studies of ME/CFS. We have our immunologists, we have our infectious disease scientists who are participating. We're doing single-cell analysis. We're looking for infectious etiologies. We're looking for biomarkers of the syndrome. And we're bringing the most modern tools of genomics, transcriptomics, and others to the study of this important syndrome. I show you in this final slide just several of the papers that have come out recently related to this syndrome from some of our best and most established scientists, including Mark Davis's group, Ian Lipkin's group, and you'll be hearing from these scientists during the course of these 2 days. So we're deeply committed to this research. We're enthusiastic about this 2-day symposium. Thank you, all of you, for attending. Thank you, particularly from my institute, to Joe Breene for your effort in organizing this. Thanks a lot.